Magnus Carlsen showed a brutal and precise way to counter the fried liver attack in this sharp game against rising star Gukesh. The position came from a common opening, but Gukesh's rare early move, knight to g5, tested Carlsen's defensive skills, and the world champion delivered at his absolute best playing black. Carlsen, playing as black, begins with a logical response. Pawn to d5, a standard move to block the bishop's diagonal and challenge the center. However, after pawn captures on d5, comes a twist that surprises many. At beginner levels, players often fall into a classic trap by responding with knight takes on d5. This invites queen to f3 check, creating a devastating double attack. White typically ends up winning in those situations. But of course, at the grandmaster level, that blunder is almost never seen. Instead, most strong players would opt for bishop to a5, which holds the position more solidly. However, Carlsen chose an absolutely shocking move, pawn to b5. At first glance, it looks chaotic. Everything seems to be under attack, yet no pieces are being captured. What's going on here? This is vintage Magnus Carlsen, deep, counterintuitive, and full of tension. Gukesh played bishop to f1, which may look passive, but it's actually the best move according to the engine, a surprising and rare defensive idea. Most players wouldn't find it over the board, making it a tricky line to face without preparation. If your opponent does play bishop to f1, stay sharp and play accurately. But in most games, players go for the more natural bishop to b5, a common mistake. Against that, simply respond with queen takes d5, which defends your knight, hits the bishop, and pressures the g2 pawn all at once. White usually castles kingside to protect the g2 pawn, but then you strike with bishop to b7, forming a deadly battery with your queen, threatening checkmate on g2. Most will try pawn to f3 to block the diagonal, but that's already a losing move. Now you go h6, pushing the knight. If it retreats, you continue with g5 and then g4, blowing open the king side. Even if white plays knight to f2, you still push g4. The attack is crushing and hard to stop. It's a sharp and deadly line that works brilliantly against unprepared players. If white captures, there's queen takes on g2, checkmate. If not, you can take on g2 yourself. You can also bring your rook into the attack. While your king might look a bit exposed, there's no real danger. You can always castle queenside, which is totally safe. That's how you can often finish the game in just a few more moves. Let's say white plays something random. You can trade pieces and go rook to g8. Even if the queens are exchanged, it doesn't save white. For example, after a check, king to h1 and then bishop takes on a3, things quickly fall apart. It could easily go like that. Now, back to the game. Gukesh played the correct engine move, bishop to f1. Then Carlsen recaptured the pawn on d5, which also opened the diagonal. Now the knight on g5 is under threat. But this time, Gukesh responded with bishop takes on b5. At first, this bishop seems to be doing some odd maneuvering, almost like it's moving under the influence. But despite the weird path, these are actually the best moves for white. With bishop to b5, white targets the knight, and now black no longer has queen to d5, the move we discussed earlier, because their own knight is blocking that square. So in this specific position, bishop to b5 makes perfect sense for white. In this position, Carlsen played bishop to b7, a very strong move. A more passive option would be bishop to d7, which is what beginners often choose. But bishop to b7 not only defends the knight, it also places the bishop on the long diagonal, setting up future attacking chances, especially against white's kingside after castling. White still had to respond to the threat on the knight, and once again, Gukesh found the right move. Instead of retreating passively, he played pawn to d4, which not only defends the knight, but also challenges black's central control. Carlsen captured on d4, and white followed up with castling kingside, activating the rook and preparing for pressure down the file. Carlsen calmly responded with bishop to e7, closing off the file and renewing the threat to the knight. Gukesh played knight to f3, and now black castled as well. After the dust settled, it's clear that while black may end up losing a pawn, they've gained a strong lead in development and seized the initiative. The defender has become the attacker. Gukesh then decided to trade on c6 and pick up the extra pawn with tempo. But after bishop to b7, white was facing the same issue again. Yes, they're up a pawn, but they're lagging in development, while black controls the long diagonal and has serious attacking chances. White played knight to d2, though knight to c3 would have been the more natural square. However, in that case, black could trade and leave white with doubled pawns, weakening the structure. Gukesh chose a slower development path, while Carlsen played rook to e8, activating on the open file. Gukesh followed with c3 to support the knight, but Carlsen immediately challenged with c5, pushing it away. After knight to f5, Gukesh looked ready to trade bishops, but Carlsen simply retreated his bishop, opening the e-file. Gukesh continued with knight to f3, and now Carlsen played queen to f6, targeting the knight. Instead of rushing an attack, Carlsen played the smart, prophylactic pawn to h6, avoiding traps like bishop to g5. Anticipating rook to d8, Gukesh prepped with queen to c2, but after rook d8, black's position looked fully mobilized. Though white was up a pawn, it was harder to play. Gukesh placed his own rook to d1, and Carlsen followed with knight to b6, a backward move, but one that opened the diagonal for his bishop and increased pressure on the knight on f3. White traded rooks and retreated the knight to e1, but Carlsen kept up the pressure with rook to e8, again targeting the knight. Gukesh blocked with bishop to e3, but Carlsen played knight to c4, adding more tension. White carefully responded with knight to f1, defending the bishop, and after the exchange on e3, black had activity but no clear threats. Then Carlsen played a brilliant pawn to c4, sacrificing a pawn to open the diagonal for his bishop. Gukesh countered with queen to a4, attacking the rook and c4 pawn, and eyeing a7. With no time to waste, Carlsen sacrificed the rook and followed up with bishop to c5, keeping the initiative alive. Now black is threatening the pawn and the king behind it. White is in serious trouble. The best defense was queen to e8 check, guarding the pawn, but instead Gukesh played the tricky knight to f3. It looked like Carlsen could just take the knight and win, but after capturing the pawn with check and the king moving, bishop takes f3 would have been a blunder. Carlsen wisely avoided it, as queen to e8 would follow, a double attack. If king to h7, white shouldn't recapture on f3 but instead take the other bishop, and despite one check from black, white escapes and ends up winning with extra material. Gukesh set a clever trap, but Carlsen spotted the danger and responded precisely. On the way to f3, black's bishop paused on c6, kicking white's queen back. To protect the knight, white retreated to d1, but after bishop to e4, things looked critical. Black's two bishops were dominating. Gukesh tried to counter with queen to d7, aiming for queen to e8, threatening the king and both bishops. Carlsen played king to h7, but that small inaccuracy gave white a surprising chance. Though it looked lost for white, with black pressing and eyeing a checkmate, Gukesh found a genius move, king to e2. Using the king as both a defender and attacker, he challenged the bishop and guarded the knight. Carlsen played bishop to b6, but Gukesh followed up with the brilliant and only saving move, rook to e1. At first, rook to e1 looks awkward with the king blocking it, but it had a brilliant purpose. After black played queen to g6, white continued with king to d1, creating an improvised long castling setup. It's unorthodox, but now the rook is active and the king is safer. Carlsen played queen takes on g2, still applying pressure, but left the bishop undefended. White captured it, and after queen takes on a3, which hits two targets, white simply brought the rook back, holding the position. Now, white is up material, and it's black who has to be careful. Carlsen played bishop to e3, cutting off the king and preparing queen to f1, but Gukesh calmly responded with pawn to b3, freeing up the c4 square. Carlsen played queen to f1, but now king to c2 isn't possible, or the rook would fall. A clever sequence that turned the tables. Besides the material, there's also a checkmate threat, so the pawn on c4 plays a key defensive role. That's why white aimed to trade it off, but instead, Gukesh played rook to f1, calmly blocking the check. Black had no better option than to return with queen to f3. He couldn't go elsewhere without losing the bishop. After rook to e2, Carlsen realized the position was too unclear and settled for a draw by perpetual check.